Andertons TV. Steve Smith, official Marshall demonstrator for the world. You've been on Andertons before, haven't you?
I've been here a few times. This is my first video experience. It is. I'm honoured.
That's crazy, man.
Yeah.
Well, look, Steve and I have known each other for a long time, long time, and I suspect the thing that we have probably talked about the most over that 15-year, maybe more, period is why can't Marshall create some of those famous modded vintage amps that so many other brands have built their entire companies off of reproducing?
Yes.
And
you know
finally.
And you know what's more frustrating? Marshall, we've been modding amps for artists for like forever. It's not a new thing to us, but we've just never made it available to the public. So now it is. If you think, I don't know, Randy Rhoads is an obvious one. 1980, he walks into Marshall. Once he's 59, you know, the famous white stack he always used, wanted more gain, so he come up with the Cascade mod for him. So it's been around, it's just never been available.
Well, okay, so we're going to show you 3 amps in this video. 2 of the amplifiers are from the new Marshall hand-wired modified series, so that's the 1959, the JCM 800. And then the little baby one behind Steve there is a new addition to the studio series, which is the JCM 900. And if all you want to do is just fast forward to a video of one of these other amplifiers, timestamps below, and you'll be able to see whereabouts in the video we start talking about that. So let's start with the 1959. As we now know, after my brief history lesson from Terry Marshall, absolutely nothing to do with the year 1959. No. That was its catalogue number. So when did the 59 originally come out, and in what way was it kind of groundbreaking for Marshall?
Well, you know, Marshall first started building amps. 62 was like the birth year, the JTM 45. Then there was a bit of a transitional period where we started getting more beefy, more powerful with the amps, basically. So you used to get like the Super 100s, which Hendrix used for a while, and which all came from that JTM 45 DNA, but it was more the mid 60s, 64, 65-ish, where we started doing 50 watt and 50 watt 1987s and the 100 watt 1959s.
So that was earlier than I thought then, so still mid 60s as a...
Yeah.
Because I think these almost became... These were quite synonymous, I think, with that sort of evolution of sort of heavier, distorted guitar sounds in the 70s, probably more, didn't they? And I guess that's where the modifications would have come in. Yeah,
I mean, like back in the day, if you think of the music happening at the time, you know, there was gain, but people used like a fuzz pedal if they wanted more, things like that. Again, Hendrix being the perfect example of that. But yeah, when it kind of moved on to the 70s, and you had more of the 70s rock bands, you know, they wanted more kind of gain. And there's some really obvious names you could mention, but the modded scene wasn't really becoming popular until I'd say the late 70s, where we were seeing Marshalls being modded. There was loads of amp modders around, and we know the names. You know, you had like Paul Rivera, people like that.
Yeah.
And obviously Jose, and all those guys that came a little bit later. But like I said earlier, like Marshall have actually been modding amps for a long time. We just never did it for the public. It was always at artist request.
So, okay, I don't have a lot of experience of playing a 1959 100 watt sort of plexi style amplifier. If you read about them and you read players' experience of playing with them, unbelievably loud.
Yep.
Unbelievably responsive.
Yep.
Nothing to hide behind. So, you know, tended to be in the realms of the good guitar players rather than the average ones. And only really gained when it was ear-splittingly loud because it didn't have a master volume on it.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing the modifications that would have been popular would have been to increase the amount of gain you could have at lower volumes.
Yes.
But tell us about the specific modifications that are on this one, and then we'll perhaps go through some tones.
Yeah, okay, so you've hit the nail on the head with the volume thing, because although a lot of people love a Plexi, you know, a 100 watt Marshall, non-master volume style amp, it comes at a cost, usually to your eardrums.
Yeah.
And like you said, there's no master volume. The only way to get the gain is literally turn the thing up, crank it. And then, like I say, most venues these days, you've got no chance whatsoever to use that. So the master volume we've put in, it's an unusual one. There's different types of master volume where you can place it in a circuit. This is pre-tone stack.
Oh.
Yeah. A lot of people think it's going to be at the end or post-phase master volume. The reason why we went for pre-tone stack is we thought the amp sounded fatter at lower volumes.
Right.
It retained more of the low end, it had more of that thump.
Interesting.
And it does change the characteristics slightly when you start to use that master volume, but that was kind of the point a little bit as well. We wanted it to sound like it was modded. It had different tones under the hood if you wanted it to. But if you turn that master volume all the way up, then it's basically stock. Okay, it's out of the circuit, it's not really doing much. So that's the first one. Then we've got these little switches along here. First one is the bright cap, and that's basically on-off. A lot of people, when they plug into a 59 or an 87, the 50 watt version or whatever, they go, wow, it's so bright. Especially when they go into the high treble channel, it's because that's where the bright cap is. But that's where kind of when you turn the thing up, that's where all the great overtones are and the upper harmonics and all the richness, that's where it comes from. So even though that channel is the most used for, let's say, I don't know, a Van Halen sound, at lower volumes, it sounds very bright, it's piercing.
Yeah.
Some people used to cut that bright cap out of the amp, okay? However, again, what a lot of people don't really understand is when you start to turn the volume up on that channel, on the high treble channel, the bright cap gets blended out of the signal anyway.
Right.
So that's when all of a sudden, when you get to the volume at a certain point on an old Plexi, it starts to sound like the records.
Right.
Before that, it's just shrill, it takes your head off.
Got it.
So if you do want to play at lower volumes with less gains, like, you know, more bluesy tones, take that bright cap off. It's a much more usable.
But we'll do some demos of that in a second.
Yeah.
What's next? Okay,
then we've got the clipping options. So this switch here is clip on off. And then once that's engaged, there's clipping 1 or 2.
I see.
And it's 2 styles of clipping basically. One gives more characteristic of using like a boost or something in front of the amp, or like compressing a little bit more, tightening the low end. The other style of clipping, number 2, is much more hard clipping. That's where kind of all the compression and the distortion is, but in a weird way, it still sounds really organic. You do get a volume drop using that style of clipping, because it's basically going from clipping diodes to transistor. I think we're getting that right. So,
I mean, okay, so let's now start hearing it. The rig that you're hearing today, just so that you're aware, we've picked out about the most 80s hot rodded looking Strat that we can find in the shop, which is, I think, a JB Humbucker Floyd Rose loaded Super Strat. We're going into the Origin Effects Halcyon Green, which is their version of a TS-808 style pedal, into the amp, into a 4x12, which is loaded with Vintage 30, Celestion Vintage 30. So we've tried to not put too much in. There's no reverb built into the amplifier. There's no effects loop built into the amplifier. So rather than putting reverb into the front end, which I think once we're getting gain out of the amplifier probably wouldn't sound great, we've added reverb in post-production. So if you were playing this live, there's no reverb, just room reverb. Okay. Now, what have you done here? What's happening with this little switch?
So, you can either plug into the top input of high treble channel, which again is typically done with these, and
because I see what you're saying. Normally you would link these by going from the bottom input across to channel 2, but we've lost that socket.
And we did experiment with adding an extra pot elsewhere, but we kind of thought it looked cooler there, because that's what a lot of the modders were doing back in the day. We kind of wanted to stick to the authentic kind of modded look. So yeah, you've lost the low input, but you can still jump the 2 channels if you want.
And that presumably made no difference whether you go into channel 2 and jump to channel 1, or you go into channel 1 and jump to channel 2?
It does make a difference.
It does.
But you can still get very, very similar results. I mean, for me, the first channel your guitar gets plugged into gets most of the signal. But you can balance it out between the 2 volume knobs anyway, between channel 1 and channel 2.
Right.
So,
but it's interesting that that first demo, even though you're plugged into channel 2, you've actually got the channel 2 volume all the way down.
All you're hearing is channel 1.
Right.
For the rock thing, for this style of amp, you don't usually need to jump for the higher gain sounds. It actually gets too flubby on the low end.
Okay, well look, I mean, you can see close-up cam on here how it's all set. So I guess what you were also saying with these controls here, if we turn the master volume up full, turn the brightness cap on and the clipping off, it's just
a
standard stock.
Yeah.
Okay, so well, you take it.
Yeah.
Why don't we start with some of those lower, perhaps more late 60s, just louder but not quite so distorted type tones.
See, without all the mods on now, it's a completely different thing. We haven't touched the EQ or anything. I've turned the volume control down on that
this
channel.
so this is apart from maybe master volume, which is still maybe 3/4 rather than full. This is a non-modded. So you can see there's no real gain at all. It's much cleaner.
It's very clean. Turn it down a little bit.
Little bit of gain.
Still a great sound. I mean, why would you want to mess with that?
Yeah, I think the players that still use this now, use the old ones.
Yeah.
They love that, don't they? They love that they can pick soft and it's clean. They can pick hard and it's driven, and it's just like boom, super responsive.
And at this point, kind of everything's really done with the guitar. So for the cleaner sounds, again, not touching the amp, just the guitar volume part. So, old school way of doing it.
Still, again, every time I plug a 4x12 in, you still sort of go, man alive, what a great invention.
Yeah.
And every guitar player, until they've tried a, cranked up guitar amplifier into a 4x12, you don't know what great guitar sounds like. I'm just saying that.
It's true, it's very true. So if we lower the volume even more, let's say, that's when you start to really hear the bright cap kind of thing, so.
It's so much. Every time I plug into these old Marshall amplifiers, my perception is completely rewritten of what they are.
Yeah.
They're so good, clean sounding.
Well, it's got a real percussiveness to it as well, and you can feel the air moving, even though we're not gained up or anything. But again, for some people, especially if you're using more of a traditional Strat or a Tele, it can be a little bit bright on the higher frequencies. So they used to take that bright cap out, so that's what the first switch does. But you'll notice now, it totally changes the character of the amp. So you'd probably want to adjust the EQ a little bit to that taste then in your guitar. So again, the idea with all of this is kind of a set and forget kind of thing. It's not something you're going to constantly be tweaking and messing with. You find that
none of this stuff is foot switchable, is it?
No. So that's the bright cap. Like I say, it's really, really noticeable. Lower volumes. So again, it just makes it more usable for those cleaner tones at lower volumes. Then the next one along, even at this volume, the cleaner stuff, you can still use the clipping if you want to add a little bit of hair to the tone. This is without. Go back to that. And then with it.
So good!
And then option 2, a little bit more. I'm going to turn the volume up a little bit because it does drop the volume.
And with the humbucker on that? There it is, man, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, people at home probably won't be picking up on this. The fact that we're still sat next to this amp.
Yeah, in fact, we've got a decibel meter. Just give it its biggest. Give it the biggest. Anything under 100 dB in here is. It's loud, but it's not unpleasantly loud. It's like fine. It's almost like it's probably my favourite guitar volume because it's loud enough to make it exciting.
Yeah, it feels
not
good.
Loud enough to go just like, oh my god, I don't know if I can cope with this for too long.
Yeah. But again, anyone that's used a regular stock 100-watt Marshall Plexi, you can't get those tones without it being unbearable.
Okay, well, why don't we try for that? How quiet will it go and still retain that characteristic?
So,
I mean, this is really more about people who are perhaps considering buying this amplifier to use almost either at home or in a much smaller band setup. You know, does it do that tone, or do you still need some sort of load box and an attenuator?
Okay, so we'll see. So I'll stick to that kind of tone for now.
That sounds amazing, but it's still pretty loud.
It's loud. Okay, so drop that volume a little bit more. And that's really quiet now.
It's super quiet. I mean, the volume level, that you had before felt like it still had, you could still hear that sort of magic happening.
Yeah.
And that was, I mean, well below like a rehearsal level.
Yeah.
The final volume you had, which was almost like, fine, I'm going to play at home and not bother the person in the next room. I think at that stage,
loses its magic.
It's like the speakers aren't moving, nothing's happening.
Yeah, I was going to say.
It sounds fine, but it's not like, doesn't sound
I think it's a
amazing.
combination of that speaker moving as well, that kind of thing. But yeah, like I say, the point is it still goes uber quiet, but the gain kind of stays there.
And to be honest with you, if you had the master volume up full, but then you decided to get a load box and run it down to that volume, you still lose all of that excitement anyway. So it's a bit like, it does feel to me like it. Apart from the fact that, you know, often with load boxes you can record out from them for just a playing thing. I think you've done a great job of not needing anything else to make this sound great at slightly more sensible volumes.
And again, I think that's the placement of the master volume as well. It just seems to keep all the body of the sound when you start to turn it down.
I'm interested that you've barely used
Channel
volume 2 at all. So again, what does that introduce if you do start to use channel 2?
All right, so channel 2 on its own is kind of the creamier channel, if you like. Not necessarily the band, even though you could associate it to that. And that's
really dark.
Without adjusting the EQ.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you were going to choose to use that channel, you'd readjust your EQ to suit. But for that,
what was the purpose of that channel on the original amps then? Was it for bass players or something, or just?
No, because no. It was just to give people a choice, really.
Right.
I mean, it was quite primitive back in the day. You know what things were like. Well, what guitar have you got? Have you got a humbucker or a single coil, or have you got a Strat or a Les Paul? It was kind of, you just choose the channel which kind of suits your style a little bit more. But like I say, if you were going to use that channel, you'd adjust the EQ accordingly. We've not touched the EQ, so we're just hearing it as it is. But what a lot of people tend to do, which is really useful at lower volume settings on the channel volume, again going back to that kind of darker sound we just heard blended in with that adds some more magic. That's a little bit much, but it adds just a real thump and a low end to it.
I've never heard a non-modified 1959 sound like that.
No.
Ever.
No.
I mean, but that's the sound. You know, again, Steve and I have talked for years. I mean, Steve didn't always work for Marshall. I knew Steve before, and we'd often have conversations about just how the sound you hear on the record was so hard to reproduce from the stock amplifiers there, and other brands were doing a great job of making amps that looked like Marshall amplifiers and did sound like the record. Interestingly, I know when I've talked to guitar players who record with these things, if you start with a sound that sounds like on the record, that by the time you get to the record, it doesn't necessarily sound like that anymore.
It loses something,
so I think the super pro guys that are making records probably are still, you know, going to find their sound out of more vintagey type amps. But for someone that just wants an amp to play in their band or play in their house or whatever like that, and just get those tones, it's killer, man.
Yeah, and I think another thing to add is like, well, it's a 59 but with more gain, but there's lots of amps out there with loads of gain on anyway, so kind of why would you buy this style of amp with a mod? And for me, there's just something about the old school circuits with that little bit extra. It's not too much, it's just that perfect sweet spot of gain, if you like. And you can still boost it with pedals, you can still do whatever you want and it retains its character.
Talking of boosting it with pedals, I did notice that I think with the exception of that intro piece, I don't think we've used the Tube Screamer at all.
No.
So it certainly doesn't feel like, you know, I think with the reason I pulled the Tube Screamer out the cupboard was because almost it was about the only way that you could tame these kind of type amps was to put a Tube Screamer front. But I almost feel like you've negated, can we just, with that sound that you've got there, which isn't loads of gain, and then we'll just demonstrate like a with and without Tube Screamer in it type circuit.
So, humbucker. And then with.
It probably does for a solo boost, just give it that little lift, doesn't it? But for the rhythm stuff, I think it's almost better without it.
It depends how you want to use the amp. Like I say, I kind of set my amps to have a generic sound, like fits everything. But then for a solo, I probably will use a pedal to boost it that little bit further. But there's enough gain on there if you're going to set the amp up with it all. You don't really need anything in front.
That is tremendous. I mean, just again from a price, and so this would absolutely start life off as a straight hand-wired 1959. Then it has the modifications done to it. And despite all that, and I've no idea whether this will be more in America or how it's going to work once you start exporting these. If you live in the UK, this is a sub $3,000 amplifier. For a hand-wired modified amp, I think it stacks up pretty well. It certainly stacks up well against the stuff that we're importing from America that, you know, are trying to do this sort of thing. I'm really impressed. That is a good sounding amp. Do the name drop, clang, mic drop, horn, clang. Who are the famous players that have had modded 1959s over the years?
There's a lot, so I'm going to forget a lot of names. Probably forget most of my favourite guitar players here, but like Randy Rhoads, Steve Vai, Mick Mars, all those guys.
What was Slash's amp based on?
He had a modded amp which he borrowed for the Appetite album.
Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yes, and we actually did a version of that, the Appetite amp, the AFD.
So that wasn't a modified 1959 then?
That one was, yeah.
Okay.
Slash's one was a modified 1959, so hit another big name I forgot there. But there's so many. It was just kind of the thing to do, especially during the 80s. If you were getting a modified rock amp, it was a Marshall 59.
Right. Well, there you go. Something for the comments section there. Link below. Who was your favourite guitar tone that was using like a modified 1959? Give us a quick, 30 seconds, just blast out, and then we'll plug the 800 in.
All right.
Yes, sir! This is it now. My childhood is flooding back to me. I can't believe that's no pedals, no nothing. Same setup as we had before. So the Strat straight into the amplifier. into the 412, a little bit of reverb in post-production, but man alive. Okay, so this is the legendary JCM 800. Legendary if you listen to guitar music in the 80s anyway. But I love my first story I'd like Steve to tell you, which is superb, is wasn't originally called the JCM 800, right?
No, because this particular model, the JCM 800, 100 watt as we know it these days, is 2203. That's its model number.
Yeah.
The 2203s came around in the mid-70s, and they're actually the first Marshalls with a master volume.
Right.
So if you think of and they had a different look as well. They didn't have the full gold panel. It was more the letterbox styling. That 70s JMP look that players like Thin Lizzy, all those guys were famous for. So that was the 2203, but in the early 80s, Jim Marshall had a rebrand, basically. Changed the look, changed the styling.
Is that where the bigger scroll logo came in? I mean, we've obviously got the right logo on the cab.
Yeah.
For me, that cab, that head, that's the look of rock guitar.
Yes, absolutely.
But come on, you've got to tell us how the JCM 800, like, why JCM 800 as opposed to, any other name that Jim could have chosen?
So a lot of the names for Marshall amps, they might be based on somebody's name, like JTM, Jim and Terry Marshall. Mm-hmm. JCM was Jim Charles Marshall, which was his full name, and 800, and that was actually a personalised number plate that he had bought by his wife.
I love that.
So, yeah.
So everybody would think that everybody thinks you've started JCM 800 as a series, then you've seen the number plate and gone, I'll buy that because we've got to see it. But no, the number plate the other way around. Absolutely superb. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so by the time we got to mid-70s, we know that music, as it probably continues to do today, is sort of, guitarists are more demanding, they want more gain, different kind of sounds, more channel switching, master volume, all this kind of stuff. When it went from the 2203 sort of, like you say, the sort of stylistically more like a JMP sort of vibe to JCM 800, was there a circuit change as well, or was it just a visual thing?
It's a can of worms, this one. It wasn't a conscious effort to change the circuit. As you know, with a lot of Marshall designs back in the day, sometimes they'd change components down to availability.
Right.
So you might get some older ones versus some of the newer ones, and they're slightly different, but essentially it's all the same thing.
That's interesting. So so you're saying that all the gain was kind of there in the mid-70s, but bands didn't necessarily start to sort of harness it and use it. I mean, that opening riff you did, it had so much of that sort of 80s glam metal. I say that sort of hair metal, like any Bon Jovi style, and it's the sound with no pedals, no nothing. Just plug a Super Strat into a JCM 800 and there's the sound.
Yeah, I think, like I said, with some component changes that happened throughout the years, the amps, let's say, got a little bit brighter, probably more aggressive, and sometimes that can be like a perceived gain thing as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's kind of always been there, but not many people just turning it all the way up.
So again, this starts off life as a standard 2203 from the hand-wired series, but we've got the mods on it here, some switches. So you better tell us what they've modded.
Yes, okay, so essentially a stock 2203 with 3 extra switches. The first one, which is named Tight, what that allows you to do is cut off low frequencies. Mm-hmm. Why would you want to do that? Well, if you were tuning your guitar down, and if you're adding the extra gain, which we'll come on to later, sometimes the more you start pushing gain through a circuit, the low end can become a little bit loose and not very controllable. So that tight switch lops everything off at lower frequencies, just to give a nice tight sound. You've got an OD switch, which is a 3-way switch. In the centre, it's off.
Oh, you can hear straight away, actually, how much less gain is coming through at this level.
So that's just stock 2203 now. Which, interestingly, going back to your point earlier, a lot of people plug in an 800 for the first time after hearing all the records, and we get this comment quite a lot. People say, oh, I thought it'd have more gain.
Yeah, not as gainy as I thought, yeah.
Because actually, a lot of the time you're listening to, or you were listening to on those records, that amp may be pushed with a pedal to just tip it over the edge.
Yeah.
So
I think, just to sort of push how true that is, there's a video that we did. What was the one that Jamie Slays did that we just, was that the That's right. We were doing the Kirk Hammett Flying V's or something, weren't we? Again, worth looking up. But Jamie does this sort of montage of sort of early Metallica stuff. And it's just a V into a stock JCM 800, pushed pretty hard with a tube screamer, was it? And it's just...
Yeah.
There it is.
That's the sound, yeah.
It was crazy.
Yeah, it was always a tube screamer or an SD one or something like that. You know, there weren't that many pedals back then either. So,
so I'm guessing this concept then of the tight and the additional overdrives are almost to negate the need to have...
exactly that. Excuse me. And then with the OD switch, you got two options. To the left on number 1 is more gain, and then 2 is even more gain. But it's not super ridiculously high gain. It's more comfortable to play, it's more compressed, a bit more sustained, things like that.
Well, we'll demo those three things, and then the last one?
Mid-shift, which actually just gives you a mid-hump when you click it on. Some people like it, some people don't.
Okay, so it's a hump rather than a cut as such.
Yes, yeah. So without the switch on, you've pretty much got the stock 800 again. You push it in and it gives you that more kind of
It almost
vocal.
feels like all of the mods are taking the characteristics of a tube screamer and just adding this into the circuit.
Similar-ish. It's not quite the same. I think the way it's done in the circuit is quite different. But yeah, the idea is that you don't need that pedal in the front. And don't get me wrong, there'll be people who still want even more. And probably will.
And other than that, is it so, because it felt like the master volume was lower, or it looks like the master volume is lower than I remember having to push a stock JCM 800 to really get it to sort of happen.
Again, it's just more usable because of the extra switches and the clipping. You can get that gain at a lower volume. You know, even though these amps, when they were released in the mid-70s and then the 800 version, which was like 81, they had a master volume, but you still needed to turn it up to get to that point of where it sounded good.
Now, again, a bit like the 1959, you've got an input 1 and input 2. On the 800, you had a low and a high input. Does anyone ever use the low? And that's just a padded input.
It actually misses the first gain stage. So actually, when you go into the low input, it's a pretty much clean sound, really. And you're right, not many people buy an 800 for that. However, what I like about this version is when you actually go into that low input and use the clipping, you can get like an edge of breakup sound, which you can't get out of a regular 800.
Well, maybe we'll try that as well. All right, well, look, just if you wouldn't mind, just give us the sort of the with and without the various switches, and that would be great. So at the moment, everything is off. So it's your stock 800 sound. Which is a very recognisable sound. I think sometimes with these amps, you've just got to play to the style, haven't you?
Yes.
Because I don't... If that is a stock 800, that's a great sound.
Yeah.
Just buy a stock 800. You know, it's like... But yeah, it's not a blues amplifier, is it? It's a rock amplifier.
No. But with the OD switch to position 1, we go from that to... It's just more fun.
It's the chug. The chug is there, isn't it?
Yes. And then 2, you'll notice a bit more gain, but I'll probably feel it more than you hear it.
Okay.
If that makes any sense. It gets you into that territory.
It's all those double string.
Yeah.
It just sounds wicked.
So then, let's leave it on that sound for a moment. We'll start to hear that tight switch on and off, which helps with the low end. Like I say, it sounds great as it is, but let's say I was using maybe a Les Paul or a guitar that's tuned down a whole step or something like that. That tight switch is really handy for cutting off that low end. They're on.
It's very effective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the mid switch, which again is just giving you more more cut with the mid-range. So again, without, with,
I think I prefer it without the mid, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think it's more. That was why I wasn't sure when you said it was a shift. I wonder if it was just sort of playing with the scoopage, because that's
Right,
a sort of more of an 80s kind of vibey thing.
yes, yeah.
But it almost isn't, is it? It's pushing.
It's the opposite, yeah. For me, it almost gets you into that kind of Schenker territory of a bit more of a nasally kind of thing, which some people love, and some people don't. But yeah, it makes quite a big difference. But again, you just set and forget to how you want it to sound, and then adjust your EQ accordingly.
Could we, again, a bit like we did on the 1959, if we just get that really beautiful kind of chuggy thing, how low can we go with the master volume and still get that, you know, sense of, oh yeah, it's still sounding great?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so
wow. I mean, I think actually it's maybe done the lower volume thing better than the 59. It's still, as soon as you're down to that level, you do lose some of that crazy excitement that you get. But it's got tons of gain, and it's still retained that sort of...
I think that's what helps the amount of gain with this one. You can get more on tap, so it helps with the lower volume thing. But again, the characteristics of the two are quite different.
So put it into the low input and play some sort of, you know, cleaner bluesy stuff then, and let's just see what that sounds like.
So again, what I'll do is I'll turn the mods off.
Okay.
And again, this is your... And just from going from there to there, it's going to sound like a completely different amp now.
Got to compensate. You need a lot more volume, don't we? Maybe
you have to, because you're missing that first gain stage. Everything just goes. So again, you'd probably turn up the preamp volume a little more. You'd probably turn up the general volume a little bit more. But again, they were never designed for that. That's why a lot of people at that point go straight back into the top input where all the fun is. However, adding some of these diodes now.
Feels like it needs a bit. Can I turn the presence up a little bit? You wouldn't normally associate an 800 with that kind of vibe, would you?
No, and
that's all right.
You can't get a stock one to do any kind of edge of breakup. It just wants to be distorted.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean. So that'll get you a lot closer. So again, it's just more usable. But that's it. We wanted to retain the character of an 800. We didn't want to take anything away.
Yeah.
We didn't want to add ridiculous amounts of gain where it just doesn't sound like an 800 anymore. Like I say, there is a sweet spot with all of these amplifiers.
Well, look, so 2203 modified is $26.99, so it's about 10% less than the modified 1959. It's a bit ridiculous to ask to name guitar players that are synonymous with 800s through the 80s, because it would have just been all of them.
Yeah, every rock band of the 80s.
It literally was.
Yeah.
That's great, man. Well, look, just go back into the high, play us out with something, and then we'll move on to its the JCM 900 Studio. JCM 900 Studio now. So the first thing I want to say before we get into the origins of 900 and what's happening in studio, this is the first time I think we've ever done a demo of where we've taken like a 100 watt sort of behemoth type amp and then gone straight to like a 20 watt variant of that amplifier. And it does reinforce, it's like, I don't know what, and again, I don't know how this is going to sound to you. You're just, you're still here in the same cab with a close mic on one of the speakers. But in the room, the 100 watt to the 20 watt just goes from that size amp to that size amp. Not like in a way of going, oh yeah, it's not as loud or it's not as distorted or whatever. It's just not as big. No. But I don't know how would you describe?
I always try and explain to people that when they say, I don't need 100 watts, I'm like, well, you don't have to turn it up. 100 watts is not just a volume thing. Like you're saying, it's a sound. It is a sound. And for me, like, the choice between a 50 watt and a 100 watt amplifier is nothing to do with volume, in my personal opinion.
100%.
It's just the sound, what you're going for. Because there's not actually a huge difference in the volume. You might lose a bit of headroom, but and it's the same with these kind of things. It's like, it's a much narrower sound, which again might be perfect for some people for what they want. Yeah. Whereas
I all through my first 5 or 10 years at Andertons of selling guitar amplifiers, I think there was a huge misunderstanding of the 50 to 100 watt thing. Everyone just went, well, if you're doing smaller gigs, you buy the 50, and if you're doing bigger gigs, you buy the 100. And I think probably the internet and just generally guitar players trying to educate themselves more are all realizing now, you can have a 10 watt valve amplifier and it still be incredibly loud. Yeah. But it has this like more focused sort of compacted sound to like 100, which is huge and expansive, but it's not volume, is it? Anyway,
no.
I hope you could kind of hear what we're trying to talk about between Steve's little intro bit on the 900 and what he played out on the 800. But anyway, look, so 900, this was my first real valve amplifier. Yep. So I migrated from having a couple of solid state Fenders, I think I had, to basically what you can see sat behind Steve there, which was a little 1x12 JCM 900. So I'm going back to, I don't know, 1990, 91, 92, something like that. But tell us about what was the history of the 900 and its characteristics.
Really, it's closely related to what we spoke about previously with the modified scene.
Right, okay.
Yeah, believe it or not. A lot of people, as we know, in the late 80s, were getting their amps modded for more gain. And then other companies were coming up who were offering that as a stock solution, particularly in LA. So Marshall were like, well, we just need to offer an amp with more gain. So it was an answer to that. So even though it was intended for that scene, because of when it came out and then there was a music change, it kind of crossed over into something else.
I'm trying to remember now. It never replaced 800, did it? No. It just ran alongside it, didn't it? So you could have your... And where did the Silver Jubilee fit in with this? That was...
87.
So you had JCM 800, then Silver Jubilee, which was a bit more over, then 900.
Yeah, and the Jubilee was only a limited thing anyway at the time because it was our anniversary. Right. So we did that for like a year in that particular finish, and then they were still hanging around for a little bit, for a couple of years actually, the Jubilees. There was even gold and black versions of those. But then, that stopped. Then you were left with the 800 again. But then, very, very early 90s, the 900 came around, offering more gain and more options, 2 channels.
This was like channel switching. Yeah. It's mad to think.
It was a luxury back then.
It literally does. It's mad to think that, God, we're old, Steve. But it's like that sort of the 80s and sort of beginning of the 90s, channel switching was like, that was the feature, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That was and again, I talked about this the other day in a video I was doing with Oz about old... he was doing a video on what the amps that Doom players like to use. And they're all the amps that we couldn't give away back in the sort of end of the 80s. Because people were coming in with their 100 watt non-master volume, non-channel switching valve amp and going, can I have that Sessionette 75 1x12 solid state channel switching?
I know.
Which nowadays just seems like, who would do that? But there was a real thing.
It was, and I think even if you wanted any kind of flexibility back then, you had to have loads of money and maybe have like a rack system and all that kind of stuff. Now it's all pretty accessible, which is great.
So look, what we saw on the 900 was the first time that we had separate preamp gains and separate master volumes for channel A and B.
Yep.
And a shared EQ. I guess that kind of format has gone on to be relatively standard for most valve amps nowadays, isn't it? But it was brand new at the time, wasn't it?
It was. And there was a couple of versions of the 900 actually. There was this one, and then there was the dual master volume one, which didn't have a second channel, it was just...
Yes.
But the reason why this one carried on is because it just became the more popular because of that extra channel. And the reverb, the spring reverb.
And was that on the 900? I don't remember. So the 900 had built-in reverb, did it? So presumably let's talk about, so the Studio series, I mean, these have been, by a mile, the biggest selling valve amplifiers that Marshall have done in the last 20 years, I think now. So Studio series has got 20-watt revisited versions of the original JTM and the 1959, and then it's got an 800, it's got a Silver Jubilee. And now, of course, we've got the 900. I don't think I've missed one out, have I?
No,
and who knows? Maybe there'll be some more in the future. But yeah, so So we're down to 20 watt.
Yeah.
But other than that, a relatively faithful recreation of the preamp?
Yeah, exactly. It's the same amp. It's the same circuit. Even the same reverb. It's got the same reverb tank as the big one.
It's a spring reverb in there,
yeah, that's an Accutronic spring reverb in there, yeah.
Fair play.
Everything's the same, but like you say, the only thing that's different in comparison to the other Studio range, because they're all 20 watt, switchable down to 5 watt.
Yeah.
We've added an extra little mode on this, so it's 20 watts, 5 watts, or 1 watt.
Oh, wow. So we can go crazy. Well, we'll see about that in a minute.
Yeah.
All right. Well, look, let's go through. So channel A, which I always consider as, I don't think it's crazy spanky clean. It's sort of edge of breakup clean, isn't it?
It is. And it's a bit of a hidden gem, actually, because I went to a concert a few years ago, and the guitar player, very well-known artist, very big artist. I don't know if you're allowed to say it, but he was...
of course you can.
I went to see Bryan Adams.
Oh, fantastic.
Keith Scott, absolutely, yeah. And he was using 900s and Voxes for a while. I was like, 900? I can't believe that for his sound, you know. But it was all channel 1 with the gain cranked. So you can get, even though it's not known for it, those more vintagey kind of tones.
Let's start there as you play the tune that haunted the charts for about 73 weeks in the... Literally was waiting for the everything I do it for you.
No. Great song, but I'm not going to play it.
You're playing quite softly there. Is that intentional because you've got gain in there and you've got to...
If I hit it... We get a little bit of break.
Pretty clean though,
It's still pretty clean.
I think what's nice about Marshalls as well is they just break up nicely. Like, it's not like some... I wouldn't sort of tarnish the whole Fender range with not breaking up nicely, but there are some Fender amps that sound incredible clean and then just break up in a slightly more distorted way. Yeah. Whereas I think Marshalls beautifully break up into overdrive before it goes into
like they're supposed to do that a little bit more. Yeah, absolutely. And like I say, this first channel, so it's a real nice sort of sweet. Not that anybody buys a Marshall to play jazz chords, but you know.
Yes. Let me load in my JCM 904 by 12 for my little pizza. What's it like? Pizza Hut kind of jazz gig.
But still on channel 1, if I turn that gain right up, you kind of get more of the. That typical kind of rock sound. Yeah, that's associated with the older Marshalls. You know.
Indeed. Whilst we're on channel 1, let's Tube Screamer over the top of that. I'm guessing it's... We're not a million miles off of that 800 kind of territory. All we're really lacking here, again, was that just bigness,
the hugeness, yeah.
That sounds good though.
But that's on channel 1, but like I say, the reason why I wanted to add that in is because people just go all clean and then all the gain actually comes from channel 2, which actually if you wanted it to be, you've got 2 overdrive channels.
Yeah.
Then the second channel is where all the gain lives. So,
and it's funny, isn't it? Obviously, I had the JCM 900, but I was never ever playing in heavier rock bands. So I remember when I first met Rabir Massad, and he was JCM 900 was kind of like a really important part of his much more progressive, much heavier kind of sounding guitar tones.
And I think in general as well, these amps are a little tighter than some of the older Marshalls. And they've actually got different output valves as well. You know, Marshall are famous for EL34s in pretty much most things we do, but it's 5881s in these.
In the studio?
In the studio one also. The studio and the bigger one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which is interesting because when the 900s came out, they were EL34 based, but then not that many people remember.
5881 is just another jargon for what we would more commonly refer to as a 6L6.
Yes,
isn't it?
Apparently it's military grade.
Yeah.
I don't know what that means to anyone playing guitar, but
if you're thinking I've never heard of a 5881, it's a 6L6. I'm pretty sure. Anyway, okay, cool. So let's have a listen to Channel 2, which I'm guessing is that's the more gain version of the 800, isn't it? Okay, so we're easily able to achieve up in the sort of 103 mark there. So, I mean, it sounds massive. Interestingly, some of those sort of tightness switches and things that you said are useful as you start to get up there, I almost feel would be useful here now. So it sort of feels really loud. You're almost in the realms of where's my tube screamer just to sort of tighten things up.
I think you're starting to crush the power section as you get up, so everything's just compressing and squashing. So let's try this 3-position volume thing on the back. So high mode is where we were at. Yeah. So we'll leave it kind of like 12 o'clock high mode, and then rather than me talking, I'll just switch down to the first one, which was 5 watts, and then the second one, which is 1, and you'll hear the relative difference. So. Well, I mean, look, it's very effective at capturing a sort of a version of a Marshall amplifier at a really, really small. It's still, I can't escape the fact that everything gets less interesting to listen to the quieter it goes. It's that perceived volume thing again, isn't it? I think regardless of tone, again, for me, it just becomes less exciting the quieter you get. How much are
you lose? I mean, I wonder how much of that is scientific with regards to, you know, what you're hearing loud is there's a certain amount of microphony in the pickups and there's a bit of feedback going on, and the more you and obviously air movement, and the more you lose that, the more you lose all of those things, and then it just becomes a bit like, it still sounds fine, but it doesn't. It's not like, oh my God, what a tone anymore.
I think it does affect you when you're playing, if I'm honest. Like for me, when it's moving air and you've got that percussive thing going on, you know, it feels a bit more dangerous to play. Let's say it's exciting, like you said, but you know, you still get all the gain, you still get all the tone quieter, but you know, and for some people that's necessary to play at those volumes.
We've pretty much reached the end of the journey. We'll just sum up the range of what you're going to get with the JCM 900 Studio and how much it is. And then, Steve, if you just want to kind of play us out with some of those higher gainy kind of tones, maybe something a bit more modern and contemporary as well. Try and move past the Bon Jovi into something.
What?
So there's a head, which is £1,100 list. There's a little 112 combo, which is £1,200. They are a little bit dearer than the previous Studio series, but I guess that reflects the added features like the reverb and the additional output stage and stuff. I don't. Are they doing a cab for this, or is it just the same cab that goes with
same
the 800?
cabs, yeah, same one. Like
So-
I say, it's just this in a combo.
Yeah, so you can get a 112 or a 212 that matches the sort of studio series. 412s, you've still got to just go for the 1960 sort of vibe. There's not like a studio 412 as such.
No.
Man alive, it has been a fun day. I said this on the factory tour when we came up there. Everybody wasn't sure. I say everybody, I mean as a retailer of Marshall and as a customer of Marshall, when the merger with Sounds took place, Sounds being the Bluetooth speaker company took place, everyone just thought, oh, is that it now? Is Marshall sort of going to give up making amplifiers and just make sunglasses and headphones and stuff? And look, commercially speaking, I think you should see the numbers. I could understand why. But no, that's not what's happened at all. Like
No.
the amp, there's the whole valve amp division, and I guess we'll see into the sort of solid state stuff in time, has been reinvigorated. It is happening. It is cool.
They're very, very precious about the heritage of Marshall. They want to make sure they're focusing on guitar players, because without the amps, without sounding arrogant, the other stuff doesn't work.
Absolutely. Well, look, thank you so much, Steve, for coming down. Links will be below. I suspect your YouTube feeds have been bombarded by product video today and this week, because it's the NAMM show now, and today is the official release of all these 3 amplifiers, so I expect, and some pedals as well, which we're doing in the next video, which you'll also have to tune in and go find. But yes, thank you very much, Steve, for coming. Please like and subscribe, especially this time of year, because lots of videos coming out and you want to be notified about them all right, because you've got nothing better to do than sit and watch Andertons videos 24 hours a day. So yes, let's go. Play us out, Mr. Steve.